Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. Two empires, two faiths, two titans destined to collide. In the West, a prince called Selim, forged in fratricidal ambition, whose name would become synonymous with the Grim. In the East, a boy king named Ismail, hailed as a living god, who painted Persia in the crimson of a new dynasty. Theirs was not merely a war for land, but a battle for the soul of Islam, a clash that would carve the borders of the modern Middle East in blood and fire. This is the story of a holy war between two believers, a rivalry that became an obsession. In the sprawling gilded halls of the Topkapi Palace, whispers followed the sons of Sultan Bayezid II like shadows. But for one son, the shadows were his domain. Prince Selim, the youngest, the fiercest, was not the heir apparent. That honor belonged to his brother, Ahmed. While his brothers enjoyed the privileges of provinces closer to the heart of the empire, Selim was assigned to Trabzon, a rugged, remote outpost on the storm-tossed coast of the Black Sea. It was a posting meant to be an exile, a place where a prince of inconvenient ambition might be forgotten. But forgotten men are often the most dangerous. In Trabzon, far from the intricate dance of courtly intrigue, Selim was forged in the crucible of the frontier. He wasn't administering a peaceful territory. He was guarding the empire's edge against the Georgian kingdoms and the fractious tribes of the Caucasus. Here, war was not a matter of statecraft discussed in comfortable divans. It was a brutal, daily reality of steel, blood, and survival. He learned to command, to inspire loyalty not through birthright, but through sheer, terrifying competence. His soldiers, hardened frontiersmen, saw in him not a pampered royal, but a true warrior. While his father, Bayezid the Pious, pursued peace and scholarship, Selim saw a world that only responded to strength. From his perch in Trabzon, he looked east, and he saw a storm gathering. A new power was rising in Persia, a spiritual and military whirlwind that threatened the very foundations of the Sunni Ottoman world. He saw heresy, fanaticism, and a rival who would soon challenge the very legitimacy of the Sultan. Selim grew impatient, his soul simmering with a grim certainty. His father's piety was weakness, his brother's diplomacy was cowardice, and the storm approaching from the east required a response of thunder and lightning. The empire did not need a scholar or a diplomat on the throne. It needed a sword. It needed a butcher. It needed him. While Selim forged himself in the cold reality of frontier warfare, a story of mythic proportions was unfolding in the mountains of Persia. It began not with a prince, but with a boy in hiding. His name was Ismail. He was a child of prophecy, a descendant of the revered Sufi mystic Safi ad-Din Ardabili, and, his followers fervently believed, of the Prophet Muhammad himself. His world had been shattered by violence. His father and grandfather were killed by rival Turkmen federations, and the boy himself became a fugitive, hunted from cave to forest for years. But this persecution did not break him. It sanctified him. In the eyes of his followers, the nomadic Turkmen tribes known as the Kizilbash, or Redheads, he was more than a leader. He was the Mahdi, the hidden Imam returned. He was a manifestation of God on earth. When he emerged from hiding around the age of 12, he was no longer just a boy. He was a living deity, his youth and fiery red hair seen as signs of his divine nature. The Kizilbash, named for their distinctive 12-gored crimson caps symbolizing the 12 Shia Imams, flocked to his banner with a loyalty that transcended mortal allegiance. They fought for him not as soldiers for a king, but as disciples for their God. They believed their devotion made them invincible, that the Shah's gaze could turn away enemy blades. This was not a mere political movement. It was a spiritual explosion. Ismail, a charismatic poet and a ruthless warrior, channeled this explosive faith into a revolutionary force. He promised his followers not just earthly victory, but spiritual salvation. He was the sword of Shia Islam, destined to cleanse the world of Sunni heresy, a heresy embodied by the powerful Ottoman Empire to the west. The boy who had been a hunted orphan was now a god king, at the head of an army of fanatics, ready to carve a new empire from the heart of Asia. The news from the east terrified Selim. He saw the rise of Shah Ismail not as a distant border dispute, but as an existential threat. The Kizilbash's messianic Shia faith was spreading like wildfire into Ottoman Anatolia, seducing the Sultan's own Turkmen subjects. To Selim, this was a cancer that his father, Bayezid II, refused to cut out. While the Sultan sought diplomatic solutions and wrote letters of caution, Selim saw only one path: total war. His frustration curdled into open defiance. He believed his brothers, particularly the designated heir Ahmed, were weak and blind to the danger. The empire, in his eyes, was a magnificent horse being ridden by a sleeping man. In 1511, defying his father's direct orders, Selim abandoned his post in Trabzon and marched his army towards the Balkans. It was a thinly veiled coup. He demanded a governorship in Europe, closer to the capital, closer to power. The confrontation was inevitable. Father and son met in battle, and for once, Selim's audacity failed him. He was defeated and forced to flee to the Crimea. But the defeat was, paradoxically, a political victory. The elite Janissary Corps, the heart of the Ottoman military, had watched with growing admiration. They were warriors, and they despised Bayezid's peaceful nature. They saw in Selim a reflection of their own martial spirit, a leader who was decisive, ruthless, and unafraid of bloodshed. They began to chant his name in the streets of Istanbul. They wanted a warrior sultan, not a saint. Cornered, his authority crumbling, the aging Bayezid II faced the ultimate choice. His formidable Janissaries gave him an ultimatum: abdicate in favor of Selim, or face a full-blown civil war in the capital itself. On April 24, 1512, the old sultan yielded. He relinquished the most powerful throne in the world to the unwanted son he had sent into exile. The Prince of Shadows had finally stepped into the light, not by inheritance, but by force. Selim schemed for his father's throne. Shah Ismail was busy building his own. His rise was less a methodical conquest and more a whirlwind of divinely inspired violence. In the summer of 1501, at the age of just 14, the boy Messiah led his Kizilbash army out of the mountains and descended upon Tabriz, the capital of the Ak-Koyunlu Confederation. The ruling dynasty, the very people who had killed his father, crumbled before the religious fervor of his followers. Ismail entered the city in triumph and, in a move that would forever change the geopolitical and religious landscape of the region, declared himself Shah of Persia. But he did not stop there. He proclaimed Twelver Shi'ism, the one and only official religion of his new state. This was a seismic event. Persia had been a major center of Sunni scholarship for centuries. Now, at the point of a sword, it was to be forcibly converted. The Shah's decree was absolute and brutal. Sunni scholars were executed, mosques were desecrated, and the population was given a stark choice: convert or die. Ismail's conquests continued with astonishing speed. He shattered the remnants of the Ak-Koyunlu, crushed the Uzbeks in the east, and expanded his empire from Baghdad to Herat. Within a decade, the teenage fugitive had resurrected the idea of a unified Persian empire for the first time in over 800 years. He was a figure of terrifying contradictions, a mystic who composed beautiful poetry in Azerbaijani Turkish, and a ruthless tyrant who personally participated in massacres. His victories seemed to confirm his divine status. To his enemies, he was an antichrist. To his followers, he was invincible. And to the new sultan in Istanbul, Selim the Grim, he was the ultimate target, the heretic king whose existence was an insult to God and a direct challenge to the supremacy of the Ottoman Caliphate. Two empires, built on opposing faiths and led by two of history's most formidable wills, were now set on a collision course. In the heart of Persia, a fire was kindled. It was not a fire of conquest alone, but of faith. A young, charismatic leader, Shah Ismail, had unified the disparate lands of Iran under a new banner, the Safavid dynasty. But this was more than a political shift. It was a spiritual revolution. With messianic fervor, Ismail declared Twelver Shi'ism the state religion, a dramatic and defiant break from the centuries-old Sunni dominance of the Islamic world. His followers, the Kizilbash, or Redheads, so named for their distinctive crimson turbans, saw him not merely as a king, but as a near-divine guide, the shadow of God on earth. Their devotion was absolute, their military prowess forged in the crucible of holy war. This new, radical power sent shockwaves across the region, and nowhere were they felt more acutely than in the neighboring Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid II, was an old man. A pious and contemplative ruler, he preferred diplomacy to war, stability to upheaval. But the Safavid creed was not something that could be negotiated with. It was an ideology that bled across borders. Kizilbash preachers roamed eastern Anatolia, a core Ottoman territory, spreading Ismail's teachings and winning converts. To the Ottoman establishment, this was not merely dissent, it was heresy, a cancer growing within the body of the empire. The Sunni ulama, the religious scholars of the Ottoman court, watched in horror as Ismail's influence spread. They saw in the Safavid movement a perversion of the true faith, a challenge to the very legitimacy of the Ottoman Sultan as the protector of Orthodox Islam. The persecutions of Sunnis within Ismail's new empire were recounted in terrifying detail, fanning the flames of sectarian hatred. This was no longer a simple rivalry between two neighboring powers. It had become a profound existential struggle for the soul of Islam. Two empires, two interpretations of the faith, two visions for the future were set on a collision course. And in the Ottoman province of Trabzon, bordering this new threat, Sultan Bayezid's youngest son, Selim, watched the storm gather with growing impatience and a cold, burning fury. Paranoia is a potent weapon in the hands of an absolute ruler. For Prince Selim, watching the Safavid threat fester from his post in Trabzon, paranoia was a survival instinct. As reports flooded in from his spies and provincial governors, a terrifying picture emerged. Anatolia was riddled with Kizilbash sympathizers. They were not just peasants and nomads. They were in the towns, in the guilds, perhaps even in the army. To Selim, they were a fifth column, a dagger pointed at the empire's heart, waiting for Shah Ismail's signal to strike. His father, Bayezid, favored caution, but Selim saw caution as a synonym for suicide. The time for debate was over. The time for cleansing had arrived. When Selim finally seized the throne, one of his first acts was to unleash the full, terrifying power of the Ottoman state upon this internal enemy. This was not a police action, it was a purge. He ordered a comprehensive census, a meticulous registration of every known or suspected Kizilbash sympathizer from the Balkans to the eastern frontier. Scribes worked by candlelight, their quills scratching out lists that were, in reality, death sentences. The names numbered in the tens of thousands. What followed was a brutal, systematic slaughter. Ottoman soldiers, the iron fist of the new sultan, descended upon villages and towns. There were no trials, no appeals. An accusation was enough. The official chronicles are chillingly vague, but the message was brutally clear. Selim was securing his rear before his great campaign east. He was cauterizing a wound he believed would turn gangrenous. This act of state-sponsored terror forever earned him the epithet Yavuz, the grim, the stern. It was a declaration of war, not on parchment sent by diplomats, but written in the blood of his own subjects. It was a promise to Shah Ismail. The holy war you have started, I will finish, and I will begin with the traitors within my own house. The greatest enemy Selim faced was not Shah Ismail in Tabriz, but the Sultan in Istanbul, his own father. While Selim saw the Safavid threat as an existential crisis demanding immediate, violent action, Sultan Bayezid II saw a son whose ambition was as dangerous as any heretic. The Ottoman court was a viper's nest of intrigue, with Selim's brothers, Ahmet and Korkut, also maneuvering for the throne. But they played the traditional game of court politics, currying favor and waiting for their father's natural death. Selim had no such patience. From his frontier governorship, he had a clear view of the abyss, and he believed the empire was sleepwalking towards it. He saw himself not as a rebellious prince, but as the empire's designated savior. In 1512, he made his move. In a shocking act of defiance, Selim marched his provincial army towards the capital. It was a gamble of the highest order. He was challenging not just his brothers, but the Sultan himself, the Caliph of Islam. But Selim knew his audience. The Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers of the empire, had grown weary of Bayezid's passivity. They craved a warrior sultan, a leader who would lead them to glory and riches on the battlefield. They saw that leader in Selim. The confrontation was tense. A political and familial crisis played out before the gates of Topkapi Palace. Faced with the unwavering support of the Janissaries for his son, the aged and weary Bayezid II had no choice. He abdicated, the first Ottoman Sultan ever to be forced from the throne by his own child. Bayezid died just a month later while travelling to his forced retirement, under circumstances that remained deeply suspicious. Selim's path to absolute power was not yet clear. He ruthlessly hunted down and executed his brothers and his nephews, eliminating every last potential claimant to the throne. The board was now clear. The state was his. The army was his. He was Selim I, Sultan and Padishah, and now, finally, he could turn his undivided, terrifying attention eastward. To understand the cataclysm that was to come, we must look beyond the grim resolve of Selim and into the mind of his adversary. Shah Ismail was no mere tribal chieftain. He was a phenomenon. Ascending to power as a teenager, he was fueled by a potent combination of messianic charisma and military genius. To his Kizilbash followers, he was the Mahdi, the long-awaited savior, a direct descendant of the Prophet. They would follow him into the mouth of a cannon without hesitation, convinced that to die for their Shah was to achieve immediate paradise. But Ismail was a man of profound contradictions. He was the warlord who had unified Persia through swift, often brutal conquest. Yet, he was also a sensitive and prolific poet, writing under the pen name Kata'i. His verses, written in the Turkic language of his followers, spoke of divine love, mystical union, and unwavering devotion to the Shia imams. This poetry was not a hobby. It was a weapon, a powerful recruitment tool that spread his fame and his cause far beyond the borders of his empire. This duality made him dangerously confident. Having never known defeat, he viewed his own destiny as divinely ordained. He saw the aging Bayezid as a weakling and the internal Ottoman squabbles as a sign of their decay. He failed to grasp the nature of the man who had now seized the Ottoman throne. The animosity between the two rulers became intensely personal, played out in a famous exchange of letters. Ismail sent Selim a golden casket filled with opium, a calculated insult suggesting the Sultan was a decadent drug addict. Selim's reply was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. He returned the gesture with a box of the finest Ottoman sweets, but included with it a full set of battle armor and a formal declaration of war. The message was clear. The time for games is over. The poet king of Persia, who believed himself invincible, was about to face a man who was nothing but war. Before a single soldier could march, before the first cannon was hauled from the arsenal, Selim waged a war within his own borders. It was a silent, brutal, and systematic campaign, not of conquest, but of purification. In his mind, the enemy was not merely across the frontier in Persia. It was a venom that had seeped into the very bloodstream of Anatolia. The Kizilbash, the Turkoman followers of Shah Ismail, were more than heretics to Selim. They were a fifth column, a nation within a nation, whose loyalty was sworn to a foreign, messianic figure. They were a threat that had to be cauterized before it turned septic. From the shadows of the Topkapi Palace, orders were dispatched. Scribes worked by candlelight, compiling vast registers, the infamous Red Books. These were not mere census records. They were ledgers of suspicion. Spies and local officials reported names, noting anyone who openly professed allegiance to Ismail, who practiced the Kizilbash faith, or who was simply rumored to be a sympathizer. There was no trial, no appeal. The lists were the verdict. Then, the storm broke. Across the Anatolian heartland, Selim's agents moved with chilling precision. Tens of thousands, some chronicles claim as many as 40,000, were rounded up. The methods were varied and ruthless. Some were imprisoned, their influence neutralized. Others were exiled, forcibly relocated to the distant Balkans, their roots torn from the soil. The most zealous, the most influential, were simply executed. It was a state-sponsored purge of terrifying scale, a deliberate act of political and religious surgery. Selim was amputating a part of his own realm to save the whole. He was sending an unambiguous message to Ismail. Your followers have no sanctuary here. But he was also sending a message to his own people. There would be no middle ground. You were either with the House of Osman, or you were an enemy of the state. With this great persecution, Selim crossed a psychological and moral Rubicon. The war was no longer just a possibility, it was an inevitability, sanctified by blood. In the spring of 1514, the greatest army the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled began its march eastward. It was a river of steel and humanity, over 100,000 strong. Janissaries in their distinctive caps, Sipahi cavalry with gleaming lances, and the Grand Viziers in their silken robes. Behind them, a logistical tale of staggering proportions. Thousands of camels laden with supplies, and the pride of the Ottoman military, a massive train of heavy artillery, bronze cannons that had shattered the walls of Constantinople. This was the instrument of Selim's will, a force designed to crush empires. But Shah Ismail was a master of a different kind of warfare. He would not give Selim the decisive battle he craved. Instead, he unleashed a more insidious enemy, the land itself. As the Ottoman army advanced deeper into the high, arid plateau of eastern Anatolia, they marched into a void. Ismail had enacted a brutal scorched earth policy. Villages were abandoned. Wells were poisoned with carrion. Granaries were burned, and fields of crops were set ablaze, the smoke a constant, taunting smudge on the horizon. The vibrant landscape withered into a uniform grey of dust and ash. The sun became a merciless hammer. Water became more precious than gold. The vast herds of pack animals began to die off, their carcasses left to rot on the side of the trail. The mighty Ottoman army, this invincible machine, was being slowly bled dry without seeing a single Safavid soldier. The soldiers' morale, once sky-high, began to fray. The grand campaign felt less like a glorious conquest and more like a funeral procession into a barren hell. Selim, riding at the head of his suffering troops, remained an implacable figure of iron will. He pushed them onward, deeper into the emptiness, his gaze fixed eastward. He was in a race against time, his army consuming itself with every mile. He had to force a confrontation before the wasteland devoured his entire force. The emptiness of the Anatolian plateau began to breed a poison more dangerous than any Safavid blade: dissent. The discontent festered first among the common soldiers, but soon it reached the heart of the army, the elite Janissary Corps. These were the Sultan's household troops, his slave soldiers, fanatically loyal and fiercely proud. But they were also pragmatic veterans. They understood war, and this was not war. This was a grueling, pointless trek into oblivion. They had marched for months, their comrades sickening, their supplies dwindling, all in pursuit of a phantom enemy who refused to fight. Whispers turned to grumbles, and grumbles to open protest. One evening, the simmering resentment boiled over. As the Sultan sat in his tent, the crackle of musket fire echoed through the camp. It wasn't an attack. It was the Janissaries, firing their weapons into the air, a traditional and deeply ominous expression of their displeasure. They gathered in angry knots, their voices rising, cursing the viziers and questioning the Sultan's sanity. They had followed him into the desert, but for what? To starve? To die of thirst while the Shah laughed from his palace in Tabriz? They demanded to turn back. This was the moment of ultimate crisis for Selim. His entire campaign, his very authority, hung by a thread. A lesser man might have relented, offered concessions, or negotiated. Selim was not a lesser man. He emerged from his tent, his face a mask of cold fury. He did not plead, he commanded. He strode into the heart of the mutinous soldiers, his hand on his sword. In a voice that cut through the dissent, he reminded them of their oaths, of Ottoman glory, and of the shame of retreat. He berated their cowardice, shaming their leaders publicly. He then made a chilling promise. The first man to speak of turning back would be executed on the spot. He was staking everything on his own aura of absolute, terrifying authority. The Janissaries, faced with this unbending will, fell silent. The mutiny was broken, not by force of arms, but by the sheer, indomitable force of one man's personality. The march would continue. Finally, after months of relentless marching, the phantom enemy revealed himself. On the plain of Chaldiran, the green and red banners of the Safavid army appeared on the horizon. The chase was over. The night before the cataclysm, two vastly different men prepared for a battle that would define their legacies and shape the destiny of the Middle East for centuries. In the Ottoman camp, there was a grim, focused energy. Sultan Selim, the pragmatist, was a whirlwind of activity. He was not a man for omens or prayers. His faith was in logistics, discipline, and gunpowder. By torchlight, he personally supervised the arrangement of his forces. The heavy cannons, which had been such a burden on the march, were now his trump card. He ordered them chained together, creating an impromptu fortress, a laager of wagons and artillery. Behind this wall, he positioned his janissaries, their muskets cleaned and ready. His plan was a cold, brutal calculation. Lure the enemy in, absorb their charge, and then annihilate them with overwhelming firepower. He was a general preparing for the grim arithmetic of war. Miles away, in the lavish Safavid encampment, the atmosphere was one of supreme, almost mystical confidence. Shah Ismail, the poet king, the living god to his followers, projected an aura of invincibility. He spent the evening not with his generals, but in council with his Sufi mystics. He believed his divine favor, his nazar, was a weapon more powerful than any cannon. His strategy was simple, born of a dozen victorious battles, a devastating, all-out cavalry charge by his fanatically devoted Kizilbash horsemen. They had never known defeat under his command. Why should tomorrow be any different? He saw the Ottomans as plodding foot soldiers, easily swept aside by the spiritual fervor and martial prowess of his redheads. That night, two worldviews camped on the same plane: the methodical, industrial lethality of the new age of warfare and the charismatic, chivalric spirit of the old. The fate of two empires rested on the convictions of two men, waiting for the dawn. The dawn of August 23rd, 1514, broke over the plain of Chaldiran, revealing two armies that were worlds apart. On one side stood the disciplined might of the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Selim's janissaries, the slave soldiers of the port, were a professional force, armed with the terrifying new technology of the musket. Behind them, a formidable park of artillery, hundreds of bronze cannons, were chained together, forming an imposing mobile fortress, a wagon fort. This was an army of order, of gunpowder, of cold, calculated strategy. Facing them was a storm of color and religious fervor. Shah Ismail's Kizilbash cavalry, the Redheads, were a tribal force bound by fanatical devotion to their leader, whom they saw not merely as a king, but as a manifestation of God on earth. They were peerless horsemen, masters of the bow and the curved Shamshir sword. They disdained firearms as the tools of cowards, believing their faith was their true armor and their Shah's presence their ultimate guarantee of victory. The battle began as a clash of philosophies. The Kizilbash, led by Ismail himself, charged with a terrifying, unified scream. Their momentum was immense, a wave of horseflesh and steel that crashed against the Ottoman right flank, shattering formations and sending men reeling. For a moment, it seemed that pure, untamed valor might sweep the field. But Selim was a master of this new, brutal warfare. He had anticipated the charge. He had planned for it. As the Kizilbash cavalry wheeled to assault his center, he gave the signal. A deafening, earth-shattering roar ripped across the plain. The Ottoman cannons, silent until now, unleashed hell. Iron balls tore through the dense ranks of horsemen, reducing men and animals to bloody ruin. This was followed by the crackle of thousands of muskets from the Janissaries, a disciplined volley of lead that scythed through the survivors. The Kizilbash had never faced such a thing. It was not combat, it was annihilation. Their faith was being tested not by a sword, but by an invisible, thunderous death that came from afar. The field of fire had been lit, and in its flames, an age of warfare was being consumed. In the heart of the maelstrom, Shah Ismail fought like the demigod his followers believed him to be. Astride his magnificent steed, he was a whirlwind of destruction, his blade cutting down Janissaries who dared to stand before him. He was the living embodiment of the Kizilbash spirit, leading from the very front, seeking a personal duel with Selim to decide the fate of empires. He saw the Ottoman center, protected by its wall of steel and fire, and charged. This was to be his masterstroke, a divine intervention to shatter the enemy's core. But he was not met by a rival champion. He was met by the cold, impersonal logic of gunpowder. A Janissary marksman took aim. The crack of the musket was lost in the din of battle, but its effect was monumental. A lead ball struck Ismail, wounding him in the arm. Another tore into the chest of his horse, which collapsed in a heap, throwing the Shah to the blood-soaked ground. For the Kizilbash, this was an event beyond comprehension. Their divine guide, their invincible leader, was down, wounded, mortal. A wave of collective shock, more devastating than any cannonball, ripped through their ranks. The sight of their fallen god broke their spirit. The charge faltered. Cohesion vanished. The frenzied attack dissolved into panicked chaos, as faith itself seemed to die on the battlefield. Selim's forces pressed their advantage, and the battle became a slaughter. Ismail, dazed and wounded, was nearly captured. The Ottoman soldiers closed in, eager to seize the ultimate prize. But in that desperate moment, a loyal follower named Mirza Sultan Ali performed the ultimate sacrifice. He threw himself before the Ottomans, crying out, "I am the Shah." His deception bought his master precious seconds. While the Ottomans swarmed the decoy, the true Shah was pulled onto a fresh horse by another officer and spirited away from the field. Ismail escaped with his life, but he left his divinity behind, buried in the mud and blood of Chaldiran. The god had been dethroned by a simple piece of lead. The field of Chaldiran fell silent, littered with the bodies of 10,000 Kizilbash. Selim's victory was absolute, a brutal testament to the superiority of his military machine. With the Safavid army shattered and its divine leader in flight, the road to Ismail's capital, Tabriz, lay open. On September 7th, less than 2 weeks after the battle, Sultan Selim the Grim rode through the gates of the magnificent city. The conqueror had arrived. Tabriz was a jewel of the Persian world, a center of art, culture, and wealth. But its soul had fled with its Shah. A terrified silence greeted the Ottomans. Selim's occupation was not a frenzy of destruction, but a calculated and devastating act of plunder. He was not interested in burning libraries. He was interested in breaking the back of the Safavid state. He seized the entire royal treasury, a legendary fortune that would fund his future campaigns. But his most strategic prize was human. He rounded up the city's most brilliant minds, the master artisans, calligraphers, painters, and scholars, and ordered them deported to Istanbul. It was a cultural evisceration, a deliberate transfer of intellectual and artistic capital from his rival's heart to his own. Yet, victory tasted bitter. Selim wanted to press his advantage, to hunt Ismail down and extinguish the Safavid dynasty for good. But his army, specifically the Janissaries, had other ideas. They were deep in hostile territory. The harsh Caucasian winter was approaching, and their appetite for conquest had been sated. Laden with plunder, they grew mutinous, refusing to march further east. Selim, a sultan who bent the world to his will, was forced to yield to his own troops. After only a week in the conquered capital, he ordered the retreat. He had won the battle, sacked the city, and humiliated his foe, but his ultimate goal remained unfulfilled. Ismail was still alive. The serpent had been wounded, grievously, but its head had not been severed. Shah Ismail survived Chalderan, but the charismatic, messianic warrior poet who had carved out an empire died on that field. The man who emerged from the defeat was a ghost, a hollow echo of his former self. The battle had not just been a military loss, it was a profound theological crisis. If he was truly a divine shadow of God on earth, how could he be felled by the crude weapons of mortal men? The question gnawed at his soul, poisoning his faith in himself and everything he had built. He never again led an army into battle. The fire that had once inspired hundreds of thousands to die for him was extinguished. The world, which had once seemed his for the taking, now felt like a prison of his own failure. He traded the affairs of state for the solace of the wine cup, sinking into a deep and prolonged depression. He abandoned his vibrant royal robes and for the rest of his life wore only black, a perpetual state of mourning for his dead followers and his own dead spirit. His poetry, once brimming with divine confidence and declarations of his holy mission, became a sorrowful lament. He wrote of grief, of betrayal by fate, of a profound loneliness that could not be cured. Selim's victory was far more complete than he could have realized as he retreated from Tabriz. He had not merely conquered territory, he had psychologically assassinated his greatest rival. He had used cannons and muskets to kill a god. The Safavid state would endure, and his successors would continue to fight the Ottomans for centuries. But its founding myth, the unshakable belief in the divinity of its Shah, was forever cracked. Ismail lingered for another decade, ruling as a melancholic recluse, haunted by the memory of a single afternoon. He died at the age of just 36, a man whose spirit had been lost in battle long before his body finally gave out. With the Safavid dragon wounded but not slain, Selim turned his gaze south. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, a centuries-old power, stood as the traditional guardian of Mecca and Medina. They were a relic of a bygone era, a state built on the glory of cavalry and chivalric pride, but they held a title Selim coveted above all, the Caliphate. For Selim, the Mamluks were not just a potential ally of Ismail, but an ideological and spiritual rival. To be the undisputed leader of the Sunni world, he had to control the holy cities and possess the mantle of the Caliph. In 1516, the Ottoman war machine, perfected at Chalderan, rolled into Syria. At the Battle of Majd Dabik, the Mamluks' fate was sealed. Their elite cavalry charged with lance and sword, a magnificent anachronistic spectacle, only to be systematically annihilated by the disciplined fire of Janissary muskets and the thunder of Ottoman cannons. It was the death of an age. The Mamluk Sultan was killed, and the path to Cairo lay open. The final confrontation came at Ridania, just outside the ancient city. The Mamluks, in a desperate gambit, chained cannons together, but Selim's engineers simply outmaneuvered them. Cairo, the jewel of the Islamic world for half a millennium, fell. Selim entered the city not just as a conqueror, but as an inheritor. He captured the last puppet Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mutawakkil III, and in a moment of profound historical transfer, assumed the title for himself. The Ottoman Sultan was now the Caliph of all Muslims. The Arab heartlands, the holy cities, the vital trade routes, all were now under Ottoman dominion. Selim had not just expanded his empire, he had fundamentally redefined it, placing it at the absolute center of the Islamic faith. While Selim was forging a new identity as Caliph in the south, Shah Ismail was lost in the shadows of his own defeat. Chalderan was more than a military loss, it was a spiritual cataclysm. The Shah, who had claimed semi-divine status, whose followers believed him to be invincible, had been humbled by mortal cannons. The wound was not to his body, but to his soul and his authority. He never again personally led his army into battle. The fiery, charismatic youth who had conquered Persia was gone, replaced by a melancholic and suspicious man who retreated into the solitude of his palace. He sought comfort in poetry and copious amounts of wine, trying to drown the ghosts of his shattered mystique. The fanatical loyalty of his Kizilbash warriors, once his greatest strength, began to curdle into resentment and factionalism. They had followed a god, but saw him bleed like a man. The epic rivalry with Selim devolved into a cold, bitter stalemate. The border between their empires became a hardened scar, a fortified frontier separating not just two states, but two worlds. Selim imposed a crippling economic embargo, choking the flow of Persian silk to the west, a key source of Safavid wealth. This was no longer just a war of armies, but a war of economies, of ideologies, of identities. The fluid religious landscape of the previous century began to petrify. On one side, Selim's powerful, institutionalized Sunni caliphate. On the other, Ismail's defiant, isolated Shia state. Chalderan had been a single day of brutal combat, but its true consequence was the creation of a permanent schism, a political and sectarian fault line that would define the Middle East for the next 500 years. Selim returned from his Egyptian campaign as the most powerful ruler in the world. He was Yavuz Sultan Selim, Selim the Stern, the Grim. But now he had a new title, Qadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain, the servant of the two holy sanctuaries. He was the caliph, and the Ottoman Empire had, in the space of 2 years, doubled in size and absorbed the ancient heartlands of Islam. The treasury in Constantinople overflowed with the immense wealth of Cairo. His authority was absolute, unquestioned. Yet the man at the pinnacle of this power was a figure of profound terror and complexity. His court lived in constant fear. The phrase, "to become a vizier to Selim," became a common proverb for being destined for an early death. He executed his grand viziers with alarming frequency, his paranoia and impossibly high standards consuming those closest to him. He trusted no one. But this ruthless tyrant was also a man of culture. He wrote beautiful poetry in Persian under the pen name Mahlasi, and he patronized arts and architecture, filling his capital with the spoils of his conquests. He was a paradox of brutality and sophistication, a reflection of the empire he ruled. His ambition remained unquenched. He began preparations for a massive new campaign, ordering the construction of hundreds of new ships. Was the target Rhodes and the Knights of St. John? Or was it a final apocalyptic reckoning with Shah Ismail in Persia? The world held its breath, but it was not an army that would defeat the conqueror. In 1520, while returning to Edirne, he was struck down by a skin infection, perhaps anthrax contracted from his long campaigns. The man who had reshaped the map of the world in just 8 years of rule died not in battle, but from a festering sore. He left his only son, Suleiman, an empire at its absolute zenith, stable, wealthy, and feared by all. Selim died in 1520. Ismail followed him 4 years later, in 1524. The two titans who had personally defined the era were gone. Their personal war was over, but the fire they had ignited would burn for generations. The legacy of their rivalry was not one of peace, but of a world permanently fractured. The Ottoman-Safavid conflict, born from their ambition and hatred, would continue for over 150 years, a relentless series of wars that bled both empires of their strength and treasure. The sectarianism they had weaponized for political gain became an intractable reality. The border they drew in blood across Mesopotamia became the blueprint for the modern frontiers of Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, a testament to the enduring power of their struggle. Their clash was the violent birth of two distinct and often hostile civilizations. In the West, the Sunni Ottoman world, with its face turned toward Europe and its roots in the Arab heartlands, a bureaucratic and military superpower under Selim's son, Sulayman the Magnificent. In the east, the Shia Safavid world, which under Ismail's successors would forge a unique and brilliant Persian identity in proud defiance of its powerful neighbor. The Battle of Chaldiran was not merely a battle over territory, it was a battle for the soul of the region. The personal animosity between a stern, pious sultan and a charismatic messianic Shah set in motion forces that neither could fully control. From the geopolitics of the 16th century to the sectarian conflicts of the 21st, the echoes of Selim and Ismail still reverberate. Their story is a chilling reminder of how the will, the faith, and the hatred of two powerful men can carve a scar so deep into the face of history that it may never truly heal.